Hey, everybody.
Howdy ho.
Hey, everybody, over here. Big talk with Erik Cason, fireside chat.
Yay.
So, I imagine many of you know who Erik is, but if you don't, Erik's one of the great thinkers in Bitcoin and very original thinkers in Bitcoin. And he happens to have a new book out right now, which he was signing yesterday. The book is called Cryptosovereignty. It's a word that I guess you made up.
Yes, crypto sovereignty is a word that I made up. And it's really important to understand that I didn't choose the word crypto sovereignty to refer to crypto in a whole as providing sovereignty. And in fact, it's a double entendre in that I want people to really be thinking about it as a compounded word of the sovereignty that cryptography itself can provide. And to me, what Bitcoin represents is the first true social contract that was built through cryptography. And it is backed specifically by proof of work and the amount of energy and computational work that must go in order to secure that contract. So,
great. Do you want to go into more elaborate detail on what crypto sovereignty means, or should we dive into?
Sure, we'll go deeper. And what's really important is as you start to explore what cryptography actually is, it's important to understand that etymologically it is the artistry of war. And this is fundamentally what cryptography was developed for. And there's a 3,000-year history of using hiding communications in different ways in order to gain an edge in having secure communication under conditions of war. And that's very important to understand the historical development of why and how Bitcoin is using cryptography in order to secure its monetary policy, because it turns out, if you look at the entire history of humanity, there's always this prerogative to be able to use violence in order to violate social contracts, in order to extract resources from opponents. So with all of that, we really need to consider what sort of sovereignty does Bitcoin offer us, specifically in a world where we exist under the conditions that violence can be brought to us by the state under conditions that they call legal vis-a-vis a state of emergency. So today, right now, if any of you were labeled as an enemy combatant or a terrorist, we can steal all your money, we can take all your property, we can throw you in a prison cell, and we can deprive you of the ability and right for you to actually be able to seek habeas corpus. This is a very, very real crisis that cryptography actually has a pretty damn good answer to.
Okay, so now we're starting to get into this, and let's start with this notion of violence. In the intro to your book, there's a quote from Chairman Mao, who says, "Political power emanates from the barrel of a gun," which is very interesting because Ayn Rand said, "Morality ends where a gun begins," and so we can see the tension between violence and morality and politics. Politics and morality seems to invariably call upon violence, which ends morality. And you talk about this several times in your book. Do you want to share your thoughts on why is it that our systems, despite when we build them to be nonviolent, eventually devolve into coercion?
Great question. And one of the main reasons is the very real crisis that the legal system imparts, not because of how the legal system's structured, but because pretty much in every constitution that you can find throughout the world, there's specific clauses within it saying that we can use a state of emergency or declared emergency in order to essentially make it so that none of these rights are actually operable, and that we can then bring violence legally to the people that we believe to be against our society. And this is what we saw during the Holocaust in the way that the Jews were slowly not only stripped of their property, but it's very important to understand that before they were actually put in the gas chambers to be killed, they were stripped of their German citizenship. And this made it so that they were non-people, and that when they were destroyed, the Nazi government wasn't actually performing a crime. They weren't doing anything illegal. And it's important to understand that in the 20th century, the 100 million people that were killed in the different genocides that occurred, not a single one of those people were actually murdered. There was no crime that was committed because the state itself was doing that murdering. And we need to relate this all the way back to this is a legality that played itself out to its most extreme ends, where it saw fit to destroy those very people it was supposed to protect. And if we bring this all the way back around to cryptography, what can the state do to steal my Bitcoin if I've secured it in a thoughtful methodology that means I haven't leaked my private keys? Can they actually get my wealth? They can't. Furthermore, what can I do with that wealth if I can actually escape with that in my head and flee from somewhere like, say, the war that's going on in Ukraine? And we have seen many, many cases of people on both sides of that horrific conflict, whether they be Russian, Ukrainian, or some other ethnicity, to actually be able to flee and keep some amount of their wealth intact. That is a very, very meaningful thing against a state that has reserved a right to destroy you if you step outside of the lines and the bounds of what they see fit as being a peaceful citizen of their society.
Yeah, I think this is where your writing and your book differs so much from so many of the other books that we read about Bitcoin, because it's all about why Bitcoin will become more valuable on a monetary basis. But what you're talking about is why cryptography attached to Bitcoin is valuable in this moral sense, in this self-defense of your very life and your very rights. And I think you go into a lot of these details. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about how rights are defended and well, yeah, just go into that.
Yeah, to start, first of all, like every single purported right that we've been given, it is not actually given. It is something that people had to claim for themselves at some point in time. And it's very important to understand that what the American Revolution introduced, and it started with the Magna Carta and slowly evolved, was that people had to directly fight their governments and say, you don't have unilateral authority over me, and that there are specific things that are reserved for us. And in the United States here, we have the Bill of Rights that supposedly protects a number of these rights. But as we've all seen over the last 20 years, those rights have been thoroughly eroded to the place that we could actually say that we don't have any more of those rights. And it's very important to understand that starting September 11th, 2001, there was a state of emergency that was declared that continues to this very day. And it relates back to what I said earlier. If you are labeled as an enemy combatant or a terrorist by the state, you don't have any of those rights. And so the real question is, did they ever even actually exist in the first place? And what I insist is that they don't. They exist through the social contract and clause that people have together that uphold those rights. And what Bitcoin and cryptography specifically allows for us is, instead of allowing for the authority of men and the forked tongues to which they speak towards rights, and they cannot hold that, we can actually abandon that and choose to build a new system where, instead of relying on the authority of men to do the right thing, we rely on the praxis of cryptography to be operable, and for its language to say, yes, this proof is valid, or no, this proof is not.
Yeah. I want to keep going deeper into the subtleties of cryptography, because when you started talking at the beginning, you were talking about how cryptography is this ancient military technology, military art, a martial art. Cryptography is a martial art, guys, right? And at one point, it became accessible to everybody else. I think that's what you would say with the discovery of asymmetric cryptography, and the game changed. Power went from the state to the individual.
Yeah, and like this is really important to understand that during the process of World War II and its development, the only thing that could be said to be more important than the development of atomic weaponry was the development of advanced cryptic analysis that actually produced some of the very first computers. And so it took the entirety of the most powerful nation in the world going to war to put all of its intellectual power into the development of cryptic analysis in order to develop these techniques of advanced mathematics that could create cryptography. Well, 30 years later, when the paper A New Direction in Cryptography was produced, and it turned out that we actually had asymmetric cryptography, so we didn't have to have these huge one-time pads and ship them across the country and keep them physically secure, there became a totally new direction in cryptography, where that radical power that the state developed during World War II that was going to be reserved only for governments and military, it now is accessible by individuals. And it's very important to understand that this technology then essentially broke out of its militarized cage, and individuals in the 1990s started playing with it and deploying with it, and Phil Zimmerman with PGP released it out into the world, and we actually had the very first of the crypto wars, where the US government said, absolutely not. This is a weapon of war. It is classified as a munition. If you take this outside of the country, you are a criminal and a terrorist, and you will be tried and charged as such. Thank God we had these extraordinarily brave men who said, absolutely not. This is just a form of thought and knowledge. You cannot reserve that for yourselves alone, and we will fight you on every front to make sure that people have access to this. And through that process, they won and deployed cryptography widely and openly out into the world to where it could never be brought back to individuals. And now we as individuals have access to the most highly sophisticated and developed cryptography that's ever existed. And we can now use that cryptography to protect ourselves in a way that I know if my Bitcoin is secured by my private key in a way that has not been exposed, it doesn't matter if the entire US military and NSA have the most powerful supercomputer that has existed and condensed all time using all energy of the sun to try to get my private key, they will not guess it.
I mean, this is what's amazing. This technology, this mathematical discovery, which we call public-private key cryptography, or similarly, the one-way functions of SHA-256, are a military technology, right? And I think this is where it's important to contrast this to lots of other discussions that have taken place in Bitcoin in the last couple of months. It's not only not violence, it's something that prevents any amount of violence from being effective. I think I wrote down a quote of yours from your book: by banishing the power of physical violence from having anything to do with the protocol of Bitcoin's time chain, Bitcoin disengages from traditional forms of sovereignty, law, and prohibition. So I want you to elaborate on that, because we've had people say Bitcoin is violence, or Bitcoin is war, or Bitcoin is this, but it's the anti-war. It's right. It says war is ineffective. The violence, the destruction, does nothing against Bitcoin.
Well, and I think it's very important. Bitcoin is inherently an object of war, but this is the final object of war because it ends all wars that can come after it. And it's not because it's some radical tool that we can use to kill and murder people. It's that it allows for the actual ethical denial of engaging in fiat and what that means to become a preeminent praxis by which we can actually say, no, I will not participate in your general infinite war economy where you utilize the taxation structure and the creation of money by decree, i.e. fiat, in order to go wage wars against other people abroad. And to me, I came to Bitcoin as a militant anti-war activist, and I saw in Bitcoin the power that I could actually stand up and say no to the state stealing my money and using that for purposes of war anymore. And when we start to collectivize ourselves and start to say, me as an American citizen, I want to go and be in alliance with Chinese citizens that are under the absolute brutality and totalitarianism of their panopticon and brutal system of communism. I also want to have shared solidarity with people in Nicaragua who are resisting that brutal dictatorial regime. And I want shared solidarity with the people of Venezuela who have suffered under some of the most horrendous hyperinflation that has existed in the 21st century. And by us choosing to put our wealth together in the commons that is Bitcoin, we are actualizing a new form of law that is the truest ideal of law. And that is why what we know as republics, in Latin it's called res publica. The translation of this into English actually comes into commonwealth. That's what law is. It is the commonality of wealth that creates the substrate that is law. We have discovered this object, and we can now use it to end the infinite fiat wars that want to pit us as nationalities against one another, when that is a despicable ideal. Because when I look into the eyes of any other individual from a different nation state here, I do not see a New Zealand individual, I do not see a South African, I do not see a Nigerian. I see a human being that I want to dignify with the right to own their wealth and not have that extracted from them by means and purposes of war. This is now a reality that we can usher in, and when we do it, it cannot be taken away. This is for all of posterity for hundreds of years, and we need to take this mission very, very seriously, or we can live inside of their panopticon where there will be infinite wars and there is no possibility to ever end it.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing, right? I think when I read your writing, what keeps impressing upon me in so many different ways, which is why I really encourage everyone to pick up Erik's book in one way or another, is we're at a moment in history. Bitcoin, and asymmetric cryptography didn't exist, wasn't available to us before. It is this new object that changes the game of not just money. It doesn't change the game of how rich you are or how it changes the game of human interaction. It changes the game of politics fundamentally. And we're just seeing the beginning of it. And I think we tend to focus on money in so many of these discussions, but this is about so much more. This is about the reduction, the elimination of violence and monopolies on violence and sharing of violence from politics. And I think this is going to lead me into the question that I want to ask you about anarchy. Growing up before Bitcoin, there were some anarchists who had some ideas, but the idea of anarchy seemed idiotic. How can you have no leaders, right? Isn't everything going to degrade into chaos? Doesn't that just mean people running around with knives and clubs, batting each other on the head? But now that something like Bitcoin exists and has no leader, and we can see that it works with no leader, it's a different thing, right? Anarchy just means no leader, as opposed to monarchy, which means one leader, or plutocracy, which means many leaders. Talk about anarchy, because you spend so much time studying it and thinking and writing about it.
Absolutely. So first of all, it's very important to understand that anarchy itself is an actual political theory that has been so thoroughly propagandized, people actually believe it means chaos. It does not mean chaos. It means rules, not rulers. And this is very important because I'd say Bitcoin absolutely has leaders, but they're not leaders invested with any kind of an authority. They're leaders that see and understand what the rule set is and what that means to people. And now, instead of us needing to go to different forms of authority and say, this is right, this is wrong, please adjudicate on it, we simply have the rule set and nothing else. And what's important is that this rule set, while it doesn't unilaterally end the ability for individuals to conduct individualized violence against each other, what it does do is it fractures the monopoly on violence that the state has and the politicization of that we have seen throughout all of human history. And to be very clear, even in America, where we've had the stable rule of law for the last 230 years, we are witnessing it break down in real time today. And this is why, like in states of California right now, people can go into stores and rob them blind, and people can't actually meaningfully stop them. And this is part of how we're seeing the breakdown of law. And it's very important to understand, no one is coming to save us. This is not going to be a solution that we find inside of politics. It must be a solution we find for ourselves. And I find it deeply ironic that as an anarchist, I'm standing here and telling you what I want more than anything is the true rule of law. And I believe that's what anarchy is going to offer to humanity. It's not that everything's going to be willy-nilly chaos everywhere. It's that we're going to tear down these inadequate and antiquated systems that have nothing to do with order, but just legalize lawlessness, and then allow for, in the vacuum of that power, for true order to restore itself. And none of us can know or understand what that looks like, because we are going to build that together as we watch our political systems fail, and we utilize the praxis of cryptography and things such as Bitcoin and Nostr in order to create this new political dynasty that will become the revolution of the 21st century.
I want to maybe offer a thought on this and get your reaction to it. I think, in our traditional systems of politics that we've grown up with, leaders are people who get to change the rules, right? They advocate for, vote for me and I'll change the rules to this or that, usually to someone's disadvantage and to someone else's advantage. In Bitcoin, which we see because it has no rulers, and this was, I think, was the point you were making, leaders aren't people who are advocating for rule changes. They're people who are explaining the rules to people who are trying to learn and understand how the rules work. And when the rules are steady and reliable in this way, we actually have a system that doesn't deteriorate through people coming in and changing the rules for short-term advantages. So this is something that can last. It's more durable. It has more endurance. Precisely because it can't be changed, right? There's this fallacy of thinking, oh, you constantly have to change something to keep up with the times. But in fact, physics hasn't changed for a little while, and neither have the rules of math, and they seem to work pretty well.
Well, this idea of leaders, it's really important that, like, during the block size wars, essentially what happened was our leaders came up and they're like, Haderp, we need to be able to make businesses more successful, and we need some big blocks to do it. And what was really great is all the plebs pretty much looked around and been like, no, that's a fucking retarded idea. And they're like, no, we're going to make it happen. We're going to push it through. And essentially all the plebs stood up and said, no, fuck you. We're actually going to run this software that an anon named Shalin Fry popped up out of nowhere and proposed this new solution and said, hey, we could actually utilize this in order to show that we don't want to support SegWit 2X in the New York agreement. And so this was a very radical thing because it wasn't clear at this point in time whether or not Bitcoin had been captured. And when I watched this happen, it validated for me that Bitcoin is actually ran by the plebs and that this is actually anarchy enacting itself in a very powerful way because our leaders came to us with a change that if this would have been done in the normalized political process, it probably would have actually passed and what we had here would have been destroyed. We'd all have to move on. But it turns out that the node structure is actually extremely powerful in being able to resist these changes and that those nodes are generally controlled by plebeians who don't have a vested interest or a leadership role here. All that they do is run and check the code. And it turns out that that's actually an extremely powerful process in order to check leaders when they're trying to do things that are actually not in alignment with the system and the desires of those users.
Yeah, I think one point I'd add to this is we called that episode in Bitcoin's history the block size war, right? So we've had something that we called a war in Bitcoin. Not a bullet was fired, not a drop of blood was spilled. There was ultimate complete victory and complete surrender in this war, right? The big blockers surrendered. They gave up, they abandoned, and there was complete victory on one side. And it was done.
Well, and it was a hashing war too. We had our chain split. There was a while that people were like, oh, Bcash is going to make it and it's going to happen. It's going to be great. And we allowed for hashing power itself to figure out which one is going to be the real Bitcoin, which one do people want to support, which one is going to be the most operable. And this used real energy, real computational power. And it turned out that the Bitcoin that we know today as Bitcoin continues to be the longest chain. And this process worked out when there was real rivalry happening and there was a possibility of collapse and it was resolved peacefully.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's amazing, right? We're wrapping up, so maybe just a final comment for me, and you're welcome to finish it off. It is, the assertion is made by Erik and others that Bitcoin is this nonviolent dispute resolution mechanism over very big things. Ultimately over all the money in the world, and we've got historic precedents to do it. It's not just a theoretical thing, like the fork war and the hash war that followed it was the dispute resolution using energy, using power projection without using it for any violence, right? And no amount of violence was going to change anybody's mind, so nobody bothered to resort to violence in this whole thing.
Yeah, Bitcoin allows for us to realign incentives in such a way so that violence itself can't become an economic prerogative in Bitcoin. This allows for us to transform the entirety of how we've managed monetary networks throughout human history, and we need to take what's going on here very, very seriously. This isn't about number go up. This is about us not ending up in slave and in prison camps where because we said the wrong shit online, we have to be in jail for 6 months pedantically listening to videos telling us to say the nice things that the government loves us. We can resist and fight. Like, you laugh, but they're like, this isn't funny. Like, I'm probably going to go to fucking jail for the shit that I'm saying up here. It is very fucking serious. And I hope that you take it seriously and that when people talk about Dogecoin, you tell them to go fuck themselves. This is very important. And not to end on a note of anger, but I want people to understand that we have a chance at real peace. I have young children, and I do not ever want them to be in a place where they feel unsafe and in danger because their government can surveil and watch everything that they do and they said something that was wrong. This is wrong and bullshit what they're doing to us, and they're stealing our money and our wealth and our property in order to run these wars. We have to resist and fight back, and we have the tools and means to do it now. And I welcome each and every one of you to take this mission very, very seriously, and that together we will make a radical change in the world that will allow for a much greater peace and opportunity for all people everywhere. My book's called Cryptosovereignty. Thank you very much for coming to this
Amen.
talk.
Oh, hi. Do you have your ticket to the next Pacific Bitcoin Festival? Join us as we shine a light on the best of Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. Visit pacificbitcoin.com for the best deal on tickets now.